Welcome to the Money Insights Podcast, where high-income earners come to learn wealth-building strategies that will take them from high income to high net worth. With your hosts, financial and wealth-building experts, Christian Allen and Rod Zabriskie.
Well, we're excited to just take a few minutes and kind of talk a little bit about this whole Invest with Benefits framework. Obviously, over the last couple of years, this has been a big push for us. And it's something that's been in the works for a long time. And I'm just going to so just bear with me as we take a little bit of a trip down memory lane to understand how we got to where we are. And my hope is that by creating some context and being vulnerable, the conversation, the time that we spend together will be a little bit more impactful. So anyone that's heard me talk about, kind of my career, whether it's on the podcast or whatever else, like I almost always go to a couple of experiences. The first experience was the experience that got me into the financial services business. And it was really simple, but it was incredibly profound. When I was 17, my dad got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He passed away, sadly, a year and a half later. But the story obviously continues there. I had a 49-year-old mom who then at that point was a 49-year-old widow with some like she was a good budgeter. She was good but she probably didn't have at that point in time the high level investment knowledge to make the best decisions. And so what happened then is she was kind of forced to rely on advisors, people she should have been able to trust. But what happened is she just basically got scammed by people who their best interest was the priority over my mom's. And I remember just how heartbroken when I made a call to, there was a REIT investment that she was given that ended up being just a Ponzi scheme. Like it wasn't even real. And I remember making phone calls to this investment that her advisor had suggested she make and finding out like this thing's never going to pay out. And it just was like a really, really painful experience for me. So I didn't get into the industry at that time with a lot of financial experience. I really got in because I was like, gosh, there's got to be a better way. And if I can just keep as many people as I can from having the same experience that my mom had, that would be a massive win. Now, years later, things have changed a lot, but that was really the catalyst for getting us into the business. And I think it developed our core philosophy, which is integrity, transparency, education, especially education without pressure. Those are kind of the core things that make Money Insights what it is today. And that was my really big watershed experience that brought me to the business. So the second experience I want to share is probably one of many experiences, but it's one that stands out to me really vividly. And it kind of led me, this and many others, led me to some important realizations that brought us to where we are today in this whole, again, Invest with Benefits philosophy. But that experience was when I was young in the business. I was 23 years old. I was hustling, just trying to make it out there. And I had what at the time was an incredible opportunity. I had a chance to meet with a friend's dad who was a high-level executive of a national recruiting firm. I knew he was making big money. I didn't know how much. I knew that he lived in the nicest place, like on the East Bench in Salt Lake, nicest, the most expensive area that you could buy. His house was massive. He drove a nice car. Those were the things I knew. So I figured he had money, right? Figured that they had money. And lucky for me, he was kind enough to actually sit down with me. I remember going into that expecting to feel like this guy's got it all, right? Like he's achieving like the ultimate level of success. So I go into this office. It's at the upper level of a Merrill Lynch building. He's got a huge office. And he was more than happy to tell me what he's got going on. 53 years old, making $1 million a year. He'd been doing it for a number of years. And then we got into phase 2, which in the traditional planning process means that you do what's called a fact find, which really just means I gather information about the client, right? I want to get a feel for what they're doing, what their financial world looks like, so that I can go back and create some sort of financial needs analysis and bring back recommendations. Well, as I get into this conversation with him, I'm asking him questions like, okay, how much money do you have in qualified plans? And I remember him telling me that he had around $750,000 in qualified plans. He was really excited about the $400,000 or $500,000 he had in the brokerage account. he had some equity in his house and $1 million term life insurance policy. And that was basically it. I remember walking away from that experience vividly thinking, like, where the heck's all the money? Like, something's not right here. So that led me to a very important realization, and that is that high income does not necessarily equate to high net worth. In fact, there is a massive gap between high income and high net worth. Now, the nice thing is if I'm a high income earner, it certainly gives me a leg up. I have a better opportunity to get to that point. But sadly, too many people in the high income space are living like they've already built wealth before they have. And unfortunately, that is what's keeping people from achieving the goals and the wealth that they ultimately want to. So I looked at that experience and I was just kind of like, okay, there's got to be a better way, because I see that these two things are not coming together. We've got to figure out how to close that gap, which brings me into my second realization, which is that the traditional path that most people are following is just fundamentally broken. And when I say fundamentally broken, I mean it is not working. People are getting to retirement age and having really no or an extremely poor plan to give them an opportunity to live the rest of their lives without running out of money, right? And like like when you're 82 years old, it's pretty hard to just go back to work, right? Like that's not really an option. So running out of money at 82 is a pretty dire situation. In my mind, it's not one that I'm willing to play around with. So I realize that the traditional path that most people are following is broken. In fact, I like social proof. Rod, will you read that for me while I take a swig of water?
Yeah. So it says, according to a study from Vanguard, high-income earners who invested primarily in traditional asset classes, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, etc., saw average annual returns of only 5 to 6% over the past 2 decades.
Okay, and why do you think that is? Curious.
Well, it's talking about their actual realized returns, because if you go and look at what the stock market has done, it'll show you better numbers than that, right? Just ask Dave Ramsey or some of these other gurus out there who say you can just capture it. Well, they're paying fees, they're paying taxes, and there's an emotional element to it. And especially the closer they get to retirement, then their advisors are saying, well, you need to be less in stocks and more in bonds and these other fixed pieces. So even if the S&P 500 did whatever 10% average across whatever period of time, you really only captured, 5 to 6% of it, right?
Yeah, and that's a huge gap. Like you said, it could be due to fees, it could be due to fear and emotional investing. Whatever it is, that path is not working. And so the idea that I can just push money into, my qualified plans, my 401ks or defined benefit plans or whatever, and that's going to replace my income, it's just not feasible. I remember going back to my high income earner experience, he told me he was maxing out his 401ks and that was like his primary plan. Well, in my head, I was thinking, that's not going to replace anywhere close to $1 million income. Yeah. So you're either going to have to dramatically increase your savings amount, change the way that you invest and, potentially increase risk, or you're going to have to dramatically reduce the amount of money you're taking in retirement. None of those options sound very good, right?
Not to me.
So, okay. So Exhibit A, the 4% rule. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but it shocks me that the 4% rule is still in practice. Rod, what's the 4% rule?
Yeah, well, it basically is, it's an accumulation method to get to retirement. So they say build up all this money inside of, again, 401ks. If you can't fit as much in the 401ks like your friend's dad, put it into a brokerage account. But in any case, build it all into the stock market. And then when you get to the ready for retirement age, then you can just take 4% of that, adjusted for inflation over the course of your lifetime, and you'll be good.
And it's based off of a faulty premise or a faulty strategic way that people plan, which is what we call the accumulation model. And I'm going to hit on this here in a minute when I kind of contrast it with our belief in using more of a cash flow model over. But think about this. With the 4% rule, and I'm oversimplifying it a little bit, but the reality is in order to have a high probability of having, let's just call it $400,000 a year of income, I would need to have $10 million that I could potentially, like in cash, in my 401ks or whatever, that I could spend down. And remember that $400,000 in that situation is still going to be taxed and at a pretty high rate. So like, there's just better ways. And we're going to get into those here in just a minute. And again, the focus is I can't do that alone. Okay. So if realization number 1 and 2 were accurate, then that led me to a very, very painful realization number 3. And that's simply that what I was teaching people just wasn't working, at least not on its own, right? And I knew, and this was painful, right? I knew that if I continued to do the same thing, if I stuck my head in the sand and just kind of plowed through, that there would be a time years down the road where I'd be trying to come up with solutions like the retirees are today, where they're like, gosh, how do I figure out how to spend this money down without running out of money, without, paying massive amount of tax? Like all of those struggles are very real.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
Can I throw in one thing? One of the saddest things that we see is that people have done a great job. People who have done a great job saving and meet that, they're afraid to spend it. Like we've been in situations, Christian, where we're telling people, hey, you've done a great job. Like you can't like go ahead and we're like trying to give them permission to use their own money.
You can spend money, right?
Yeah, they won't.
It's a really great point. So now I want to contrast that with experience after experience after experiences where Rod and I are starting to meet with people who are finding real success in building wealth. And we we were like hit in the face with a mega trend. And the mega trend was that most of those people, maybe almost without exception, were investing in things beyond just stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. They were oftentimes investing in alternative assets, the most prominent of those being real estate in all of its various forms. But it created a conviction in us that, okay, if we're seeing this situation over here, A, B, and A is just kind of like, we can see the struggle, and then we're comparing it with this other situation. Like it just became so obvious that we needed to make sure that we brought in the alternative asset side of things. And so I almost forgot this. Quick social proof, because I love social proof. Research from the Boston Consulting Group shows that portfolios incorporating alternative assets, meaning real estate, private equity, etc., actually have historically provided better risk-adjusted returns. And I love this concept of risk-adjusted return because typically when we think about how we invest, we think about the return that I'm getting, but sometimes or frequently we're not considering as closely the risk that I have to take to get that return. And so what we're suggesting is that when I move to the alternative space, there are many opportunities to get the same types of return or better, but have a better overall risk-adjusted return, which just means that my ratio of risk to reward is in better tact.
You mean you don't always have to take on more risk to get a better return? Like that's the way they make us think.
You're right. That is constantly what's beaten in our heads. And the reality is that's just not true. There's things that we can do, especially when we start focusing on optimization and we start focusing on optimizing key principles, because that shaves a lot of that stuff. It just can push a lot of that stuff to the side. Okay, so we've brought in alternative assets now. That's what Money Insight's next goal was. We had to figure out how we could bring together the best of both worlds and create a real tangible value, something that we could believe in, teach people with conviction, knowing without question that the result would absolutely be there. Okay, so I beat up for the last 5 minutes on kind of the traditional investing space, and we do that from time to time. But I also want to emphasize that it's not all bad, and we genuinely do want to bring together the best of both worlds. And Rod, I was just curious if you can think of any situations, and I know you can, but give us a couple of situations where using traditional methodologies actually can be really effective, because I think it's important that we don't get overly extreme on either side. We really just want to look at each situation for what it is and make the best financial decision. And I feel like without question, by doing that and optimizing the 6 core pillars we're going to talk about, that's going to be what gets us there.
Yeah. So a couple things come to mind. The first one is recently my son, Chase, he graduated from college, got his first job, shows up and he meets with the HR director and they say, here's the benefits package, take a look at it. Well, one of the options was to opt into the 401k plan where they're going to match 100% of his contributions up to 6%. And even more above that. To me, it was shocking because it's been a long time since I've seen many companies that are offering this. But so he's like, well, so what do I do? It seems like I should, and I'm like, yeah, you absolutely should. Like, there's no question. And what was really in this case, what I was really grateful for is that not only were they offering the match, but they offer a Roth option for him, which is perfect for someone who's just getting started in a low, relatively, right, compared to his career, low income starting point, to be able to set the money aside after tax and then be able to take it out tax free later. But even if it hadn't been, even if it was not a Roth and it was traditional, it was going to be pre-tax, still 100% match. How can you say no to that? So I feel like that's one example where you just have to.
Yeah, so. And I think it's a really great example because the reality and it's also an example of the progression of even the traditional space, right? So that's why I hate to play too far on one side or the other, because like the reality is there's good in both places, and most financial vehicles and products have value. It's just figuring out how to utilize those values to create the most benefit for us. Another example that comes to my mind, I bring this up all the time too, but if I'm let's just say I'm a physician and I'm 52 years old and I haven't saved to the level that I want to, well, things like a defined benefit plan where I can stick significantly more money away tax deferred. Well, typically I wouldn't tell a 35-year-old to go heavy on the tax deferred side just because taxes are likely, especially if they're a good saver, but because taxes are likely to go up, right? We're at the lowest historical tax rates that we've seen. We've got a mess in the economy and Social Security. Like, taxes are just far more likely to go up than they are to go down. But if I'm at that place in life, I'm not going to be able to catch my current income. So I need all of the power I can get behind it. In a situation like that, dumping a bunch of money into a defined benefit plan could be a really great way to at least create some catch up. And so that's another kind of example that comes to mind. Is there any others you want to hit on before we move on, Rod?
Really quickly, I'll do one, and that is we're gonna tell you why the just building up that accumulation phase or accumulation method isn't the best idea. But even if someone sticks in that, still having assets on both sides help a bunch. And what I mean is, if you're only in the stock market, that's where the 4% rule comes from. Well, guess what? If you have assets that are not correlated to the stock market, so that when it is losing value, you can take money from somewhere else and let it recover, even just doing that allows you to take a higher percentage. You could take 6-7% in that scenario, where you wouldn't dare do that if you were only in the stock market. So again, I'm not saying that's the best either, but if you find yourself and you're like, well, I'm too far in, the accumulation method is just really what I'm going to have to do, then think about that. Think about having assets that are not correlated to the market in addition to what you have there.
Yeah, it just gives a lot of freedom and flexibility that you don't have if all of your eggs are in the same basket.
Yeah.
Okay, so enter the Invest with Benefits framework that we've talked about. And Invest with Benefits consists of 6 core pillars, and this has kind of moved over time. And when we initially started, we were trying to I don't know what the right word is, but we're really trying to lock in on what works, because all we were doing is we were taking the principles, the ideas, the strategies that we've been using for the past decade and trying to compile them into like a cohesive philosophy that people can grab hold of and understand. And so the goal behind Invest with Benefits is really to maximize every dollar or optimize every dollar that comes into our financial world. And we do that by focusing on optimizing these 6 key principles: leverage, velocity, cash flow, tax optimization, asset protection, and estate maximization. I'm just going to hit on a couple of these really quick that I'm passionate about. I always talk about leverage because it's the most powerful wealth building principle available to us without question. Unfortunately, it's also the thing that can hang us the fastest. So our advice to people is to use what we call conservative leverage, right? And again, that can mean something different to each person, but we kind of know that there's a line that we have to make sure that we're not crossing. A quick tip is to make sure that I have plenty of cash on side. That'll help me with the leverage situation. I also want to talk about cash flow the cash flow model versus the accumulation model. And this is kind of what we've been referencing when we get to the 4% rule. Well, when I just try to save up all my money and I'm just building a nest egg that I intend to either try to live off the interest or I intend to spend down over time, that's typically what we call the accumulation method. And that's what we're saying is incredibly ineffective. Because again, I think about if I want to have $1 million income, right? Many of you listening to this are 7-figure earners. If I want to replace that, how many of you have 40 or $50 million sitting in, your qualified accounts? Like it's just kind of a crazy way to do it. The nice thing is you can, by building in the alternative side, by utilizing real estate, you can create cash flow and make sure that the underlying asset is simultaneously growing with you. And of course, by doing that, you're now making a real difference and you're able to take the income that you want while still growing the wealth that you want. And that's what I saw like repeatedly from people. The last thing I'll talk about really quick is tax optimization, because this is the expense this is every high income earner's largest expense. If we can shave off a piece of that, right? If we can shave off a piece of that, bring it back into our world, optimize it within these six core pillars, now we have an opportunity to do something really, really impactful. And just by doing that, I'll suddenly find myself in a lot better situation. And Rod's going to talk about what it looks like in action here in just a second. And I'll just close by hitting on the benefits that I can expect by making sure that I'm optimizing those 6 core principles. And it is simply higher investment returns, optimize cash flow, maximize retirement, massive tax savings, and ultimately, especially if you're a high income earner and that's your starting point, you have the opportunity to build generational wealth because of the fact that you've got the power to save and optimize these things. So my advice to everybody is to take advantage of that opportunity and make sure that you're optimizing these things. And with that said, Rod, I'll pass it over to you to talk about how to actually put these principles into action and some of the results we can see from doing that.
Yeah, and we're going to do that by using a client, kind of taking this as a case study. So everybody meet Jonah. Jonah, we met him for the first time probably 7-8 years ago. And at the time, he was a W-2 employee, high income, and he was between what he was saving actively and then what he had a little bit of inheritance. He was investing, but it was all in the stock market, kind of like what you were talking about, 401k, brokerage account, but all in the stock market. And he had a realization, basically, kind of like what you said earlier, a realization that wasn't going to get him there. He was still pretty young, relatively speaking, pretty young, but he saw it. He could see that the trajectory just was not going to get him to where he needed to be. Kind of to your point, if he's a $500,000 income earner and he needs 4%, and he's going to use the 4% rule and replace that, well, still it's going to be 20 years in the future, so probably bigger than 500. But let's go with that. 12.5 million is what he needs to accumulate by then to even go on the 4% rule. And by the way, the thing we didn't say about that is the 4% rule has an 80% chance of success. So 20% chance that it fails. So
yeah, anyway. And that's why people have decided to bring it down, right? It's the 3.2% rule. Like it's just become less and less effective as the volatility has blown up the model. So it's just one of those things that again is sadly actually being used. I'm like mortified every time I hear it, but it's actually being talked about consistently by the traditional financial planning space. And it's just, in my opinion, the least effective way to do it.
Yeah. And so what he realized was he's going to either have to save a lot more than he already was, what does he need to save? Like 40% plus, right? To get where he needs to be. Secondly, he could take on a lot more risk, which obviously could mean that it fails miserably and he's much worse off. Or third, settle for less in retirement. And he said, I don't like any of those answers. I want to go find something different. And that's when he found this whole idea of using alternative assets and really just a whole alternative approach to planning for retirement. So what he's done, he still maintains a practice, and he built a business, like a telehealth business. And so he has multiple streams of income from even just within his business world, and it's different. So you talked earlier about tax optimization. He can do things differently in a business than he could as a W-2 employee in terms of tax, like true tax savings, not just deferring taxes in a 401k or those kinds of things, creating true tax savings. So that was a big deal for him. He switched most of his funds into alternative assets and the kinds of things that you mentioned. Again, real estate is a big one. Even inside of his business, capital investments inside of the things that he's doing, technology to make what he's doing better, but that also bring value as well. Working towards setting up streams of income for retirement. So to your earlier point, instead of just using the accumulation method and counting on having enough to be able to live off that 4%, saying, hey, forget all that, I'm going to create streams of income. And it's important to realize when we talk about this, you still have to be diversified and have multiple streams, right? Depending on who you listen to, 5 to 7 would be a minimum. Because sometimes you might have hiccups in one or another, or different risk profiles on the different ways that you're creating those streams of income. And so it's important to do it that way. So he shifted to that mindset, and then take advantage of, I talked about tax strategies inside of his business investing, but there's a lot that you can do in the alternative space, like Christian talked about a minute ago, where you can create these tax savings as well. He uses conservative leverage strategically to build what he's doing, specifically with one of the strategies that we worked on with him. He's leveraging life insurance to build future income and create a lot more income by using the leverage than he would if it was only his dollars going into the plan. And then the one that I want to focus on here for the next few minutes is just the investment optimizer. And many of you may be familiar with that. Jonah uses the investment optimizer in conjunction with his investments. And just really quickly, the investment optimizer is a way that we can create an additional layer of growth, of return inside of our investing. So you're investing in the exact same things, but instead of flowing money through a bank account or a money market account or whatever, you flow it through highly overfunded cash value life insurance policy, where you can create additional layers of growth. There are tax benefits that we can create. There's additional efficiencies by the way that we flow it. If this is new to you, go to moneyinsightsgroup.com. We have a webinar there. You can take a look and learn a little bit more about that. But ultimately, this is where one of the things that Jonah decided to use in conjunction with his investing. And so when you look at it in the context of the 6 pillars, it uses leverage. It's the epitome of the strategy is using leverage, because what happens is the money that you've put in your account, when you're using it, you don't actually take it out of the account, you take a loan against it. Your money stays there, continues to grow. You're using OPM, right, other people's money, to go out and do the investing. You flow your money through the loan side while your money stayed there and kept growing. So you're literally creating value in multiple places at the same time. Velocity is the concept where I'm trying to get as quickly from one investment into the next. And so I have just multiple things going on. And again, the investment optimizer, because it is the place where we're flowing everything, it helps us not just in the flow in and out of the investments, but in the efficiency of that, because again, we're creating additional layer of growth that's happening all the time, right? All the time. And then cash flow. I mean, it's all about cash flow, right? You invest in something, you create that cash flow as you're flowing that back. One of the things you'll learn about in the webinar is that, yes, you're paying interest on the loan that you took, but you end up paying simple interest on the loan while earning compounding interest inside of your account. And that creates a huge arbitrage in your favor. Okay, tax optimization I talked about. I had just really quick. This is an example on the cash flow of an investment. If you put 100,000 in, and from the actual investment, the pro forma says you'll get a 16.5% IRR. Well, if you do again, same investment, same 100,000 going in, but you've used it through the investment optimizer policy strategy, you turn that 16.5% return into 20.8. And instead of 176,000 coming out off of that original 100,000, you get 206, right? So huge benefit on the cash flow. With tax inside of these policies, you're putting the money in after tax, but it grows tax deferred. You use it tax free. When you die, the death benefit pays out tax free. So it's really optimized from a tax standpoint, carries with it asset protection, just naturally within life insurance, it does that. And then, of course, it is life insurance, right? Estate maximization, you're getting this much larger death benefit that pays out when you pass away. Okay, Christian, I know we're at our time, so I'm gonna go with that.
Okay.
But just again,
great.
The point is that here's a real life example of somebody who had the same realizations and is making it happen and is on a very different trajectory today to his retirement than he was even just 7-8 years ago.
Thank you for listening to the Money Insights podcast. To learn more about the financial and business strategies discussed in this show, please visit moneyinsights.net. The views and opinions expressed on the Money Insights podcast are not intended to be individual financial, tax, or legal advice. Always consult with the appropriate advisor before making financial decisions. And if you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This will help others find the show and learn wealth building strategies for themselves. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.